Welcome back, everyone. Whether you're on Zoom or here in the room 1060 in the Biological Sciences building, thanks for returning. We have our distinguished speakers here, ready to answer questions, have a discussion. So please, either if you're on Zoom and you'd like to submit a question, please put it in the Q&A, and we will transmit it to the room. And those of you who are in the room, if you'd like to ask a question, let us know, and we have Sammy running the cube, the soft cube, who will bring it to you.
Hello? Yep. Awesome. Hello? There we go. So hi, everyone. Thanks again for coming back for our moderated discussion. My name is Nia. I'm a PhD student here in EEB, and I guess I'm going to start us off with questions, but then if my questions inspires you to ask questions, Sammy will be going around with the mic so that everyone can ask. But my first question is open to anyone or maybe all of you. How much of your work is advocacy versus research, and what specifically informs that?
I mostly do research and education, informal education. I do work with some community groups, but I think that they're probably better advocates than I would be.
Yeah, I think that for me, historically, my work has mostly been research, but over the last 3 to 5 years, it's become more advocacy. I would say that I think it depends on how you're sort of picturing advocacy. I work within community, and I work with individuals and try to support what they're trying to do. So it's a bit more behind the scenes advocacy as opposed to leading a march kind of advocacy. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, I'm going to put this down. I think my work is a bit of both, and it doesn't always feed into my research, which may be part of the distinction. So I see my work as hopefully being relevant to advocacy groups and groups that are organizing, but I also am just there to help, right? So sometimes what one group I'm working with, I'm kind of just a attendee, right? I'm a participant, a member of the group, and if they need space, then I can make those room reservations at UNCC, right? And so there may be opportunities for that to feed into research, and vice versa. There may not be, but I think part of the work is just trying to make sure that it's out there. So if there are questions that need to be asked, then I can help and assist with that.
Oh. Awesome, thank you. Do we have other questions out in the, yes, I think we have one in the back.
Yeah, this is sort of related, and I'm from the School for Environment and Sustainability, and we do more apply. The ecologists that are in Cs do more apply work, or tend to do apply work. And so we have been, because of the nature of that apply work, we have been doing interdisciplinary research for a long time, and we have been asking these sort of questions for a long time. But I think at least Steward and Alex, I'm not sure about you, Fushcia, but you're in EEB departments types, and I'm just wondering how your other colleagues in EEB have receive the kind of work that you're doing now, and whether you have encountered any resistance to that type of work.
So I will say that luckily, for the most part, I have received zero resistance. I think that that's mostly a product of, in most cases, so most of my interdisciplinary sort of adding in the social elements didn't start until towards the very end of my PhD and into my postdocs. And for my postdocs, I had my own funding, so no one could tell me what to do. And so I think having that sort of control over the direction of my work has been quite helpful. Now, so like right now I'm doing my work in Princeton EEB department, and that department is like very science focused, and so I actually get quite a bit of support from the anthropology department. But my funding, again, comes from an interdisciplinary center, so it allows me to do work that crosses all those boundaries. And yeah, like I said, so far no one's gotten in my face about it, and I hope that, you know, my hope is for that to continue, but I know that everyone's experiences in that regard are quite different.
I'm fortunate to work in an institution that has a fair amount of budget flexibility, and that helps a lot. But when unlike Alex, I started my sort of social ecological work relatively later in my career, and when I first started doing that, there was an immense amount of resistance to it. Fortunately, getting that LTER funding was a useful ticket, but still, even today, there are people, some down the hall from me, some elsewhere, who don't get it, don't get what I'm doing, don't get why I'm excited about working in cities at all, or why, if you work in a city or an inhabited place at all, you have to work in a social ecological way, but I just ignore them. I'm old and ugly enough. I can just ignore them.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not in a ecology department. My department is geography and earth sciences, and it's been helpful because it's both human and physical geography, and so there is someone in my department that understands at least some part of my research program, but I'm absolutely like the social scientist in science heavy, you know, physical science spaces or environments, and I am the engineer or the scientist in social science spaces, right? And so I think my identity and how I'm received really shifts depending on what topic I'm bringing in and who's in the room, but at least with my department, it works, so.
I have a question over here as a bit of a follow-up from Yvette's question. Forward-looking, let's say 20 years into the future, if EEB departments adopt an anti-racist agenda very seriously, how do you think the educational mission and the research mission and just the operations would change, would differ from what we have now? I guess I'm thinking get your perspectives on what would be distinctively different if you walked into an EEB department 20 years from now that took this as a major goal. And what would we might still see people in rooms and in labs, but what would be fundamentally different that would strike us as different?
I mean, I'll take a stab. I feel like this is more of a like, what's your dream question? So just thinking about what that might be for me, I think it's at various levels, right? So I think it wouldn't be enough to just focus on how people do the research. And I think one part of that is like the research should be able to also interrogate the social implications of the research, right? I think that there should be some sort of explicit component there. And I know that some research isn't necessarily well suited to a direct connection, but I think that there should be ways in which people think about how the work that they do can connect back to sort of broader societal like needs. But I also think it would really mean interrogating like who is doing the work, right? So not only like what the work looks like, but who is doing the work, what structures are in place at institutions to support people from diverse historical backgrounds that have been historically excluded from these spaces, and what are they doing to challenge that and to, you know, I'm trying to avoid saying burn it down and rebuild it. But really think about like how do you start from something like a blank slate? Because I think that trying to adjust things under a current system is a flawed way to think about it. So I think you really have to kind of go back to a drawing board in a lot of different ways to really build something that has those values inherently built into it. So that's a vague answer, but that's kind of where my mind goes immediately.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about kind of decolonizing or having an anti-racist model, right? To Alex's point, I think a lot of it means, you know, that your graduate student body are students of color, first gen, low income, like international, national. Your faculty look like the students, right? They are also people of color and also, you know, first gen in that area, low income, or from historically minoritized communities. Your leadership is also diverse, right? I think that's one of the biggest ways in which organizations or departments typically fail and lose sight of a level of self-awareness that's required in order to actually engage fully in anti-racist work, is that the leadership is still majority white, right? And so I think that those are all really important elements that you have to have, in addition to rethinking the way that we value science, right? Especially in most STEM fields, you know, we look at publication rate or what is considered, you know, data even, and even quantitative versus qualitative valuations. The fact that we still, well, not we, because I don't use this term, but the fact that I still hear people referring to a distinction of the soft sciences versus the hard sciences, right? I think that's already putting a valuation on qualitative work and community engagement, and all of those things take more time. And so if you are going to invest in that, you then also have to slow down and rethink your expectations and your model for things like tenure or research, as well as the training that you are providing to both the researchers or even community groups that you're working with or citizen scientists.
I wanted you all to answer first because you're the future and I'm the past. But who knows whether I'll be hobbling into an EEB department in 20 years and even be aware enough to know what I'm doing. But I think that the field, in addition to what they said, the field, well, in part you said this, but here's my emphasis. Ecology needs to become a much more self-reflective practice. It has to realize that philosophy of science and sociology of science didn't stop in 1932, and that there are new ways to think about the scientific process and how it is embedded in social needs and backgrounds and connections. And if we really start thinking about our science as social and socially embedded, we can't just keep doing things the same way. So that's a little bit.
So along those same lines, what type of advice might you have for graduate students or other early career scientists who are hoping to add a new element of anti-racist work or anti-racism or just justice in general into their current quote-unquote traditional research?
Yeah, that's always a question that I get, and I think is tricky. I think if we assume that we're working under like an NSF model, so let's assume that that's what we're doing. I think a lot of times you can fit these more social, anti-racist practices and approaches into your like broader impacts section, right? Like that's really what that's written there for. But I like to use that as an opportunity to also say that like I will be doing this in my work. Like my science is not separate from sort of like my personal practice and values. And so I think that we already have a structure in place with at least with that sort of big agency for incorporating these things. And also NSF has, not to praise NSF because there's also problems with everything, but they do have newer calls for social ecological systems research, right? So you can fit these things into those areas. I think that it gets a bit trickier when you think about other granting sources, but I think there's always a great argument to be made about how doing this interdisciplinary work will provide more robust outcomes and solutions and practices to the science questions, right? So I think that it's really easy to allow them to leverage each other. So I think that's where I would start, but this is one of those things that you could really get into a longer conversation about for sure.
Yeah, I think adding on to that, one of the biggest observations I've noticed in terms of quantitative STEM researchers is kind of the approach to research, right? And in particular, thinking about things outside of STEM disciplines, right? And often it looks something like, oh, I put this grant together with this co-PI. Oh, surveys would be great. Or, oh, we need a human component for broader impacts. Okay, let's go ask this other, faculty researcher, someone who we think fits that area to kind of tack on or add on this component. And so I think it really starts at the very beginning, right? What is the actual question and design of your methods that you are employing? Because broader impacts and that work should be folded in at every stage of that and every aspect. And so for graduate students, if you're able to take a course in sociology or, anthropology, I think that is one of the kind of the best things you can do as a student is to gain both an understanding of the terminology and also the skill and difficulty that those fields require, so that when you do begin to work with others, right, you now have a foundation from which to be able to figure out, like, what type of social scientist do I actually need in this project? What type of questions am I really trying to ask that yield a certain level of expertise or a certain type of expertise? And so, and I also say this recognizing that, like, my graduate program was interdisciplinary. So I took courses in a lot of different departments and colleges. And so I think part of that then may look like, auditing a course. Is there a certificate? Is there even just seminar series within different departments? Because the way a sociology seminar moves is very different, right? It is much more, you are reading a paper. And I think even that can be a different way of taking in knowledge and thinking about how research is presented and conducted. And so I think exposure, right, is one of those things that students can do to really help set them up in engaging in fields outside their discipline or outside kind of adjacent disciplines.
Mia? Sorry, we have a question from the Zoom world. Should I bring that one in? Gina asks, we heard a really nice summary about racial justice and ecology. What topics should be considered when thinking about racial justice and evolution? I can think of perhaps crop breeds that might do better in urban landscapes for food production and wonder if such crops are being developed, but surely there are other topics relevant to evolution. Any thoughts?
One of the things that we tend to forget is that some of the very earliest examples of selection in the wild were actually urban examples. And so I think we can much more effectively or usually exploit urban environments from the perspective of selection pressures and population differentiation. And fortunately, there's a lot of work that's going on in that now. I think that's a really a big growth area. But philosophically, again, environments are not static. Populations are not static. And if we think about those two things together, that's going to make us think better about all of our environments.
Yeah, I'll just add on a small little section because my brain is mostly ecology brain these days. But I will say that, like, even in the practice of evolutionary research, like, you often still require engaging with people to do that work, right? And you often also need to collect samples. You might be doing molecular stuff. You have to go to places. You have to get permissions. Like, everything that is still relevant to ecological research, just with different actors in place, I think are all still very relevant in evolutionary research. And so it may seem less intuitive, but those elements are still quite present, and I think worth asking yourself, you know, interrogating those practices and processes, even from an evolutionary perspective. So that's my quick quip on that.
I want to ask a question about going back to the structure of departments that we were talking about a moment ago. And this is a question for, on the one hand, Steward, and on the other hand, Fushcia and Alex, because you are two different age categories. Me and Steward are similar. When I first came to the University of Michigan as a faculty member, there was no EEB. So to suggest that the field of EEB somehow has canonical elements associated with it is kind of absurd, because I came here in the Department of Zoology. There was zoology and botany, and I need not go through the litany of all the various changes that happened. Now, on the one hand, there were changes that were legitimate changes because the science actually advanced, but there were many changes that happened simply because people talked to one another. People asked questions about why their discipline was doing what it was doing, and actually sometimes, rarely I will say, but sometimes took up the conversation of where should the discipline be going, and how can we at Michigan engage in structuring our work so that it moves in what we think is the right direction. So my question for Steward is, I want you to comment on that. And my question for the other two faculty members, the younger faculty members, Fushcia and Alex, do you get a sense in your department, and it's not a question in my mind of how interdisciplinary it is, Fushcia. I think this applies to geography just as much as it does to EEB. To what extent do you feel kind of either personal or social pressure that you, as a matter of fact, are the folks who are deciding where this field is going to go in the future?
Well, okay. I'm fortunate to live in an institution that doesn't have departments, but it's about the size of a university department of ecology of one or another sorts. And one of the things that sort of surprises me is how conservative we are, and how we don't necessarily think deeply about what do we need to change. What do we need to change? So I guess I'm leaning on the reflectiveness again, or reflexivity again. And I think that regardless of the structure you're in, having conversations that are asking about what can we do differently? And often I think that's stimulated by looking out in the world. And there's so many pressing problems in the world that if you look out into the world and then you look at the talent base or the interest base in your department or college or whatever, there may very well be mismatches. And that's an opportunity to say, okay, department or school or whatever, what do we need to do differently? And another way to think about it is, especially with global change, which includes climate and sea level rise and urbanization, how do we need to array ourselves to be able to understand those changes, help generate knowledge about those changes that's useful. So I think we've got a real big job to do. It's almost like the founding of ecology itself, which was an amalgam of field botany and field zoology and laboratory anatomy and physiology and things like that. Boom! That was just that's the kind of revolution we need now.
Well, I guess there's a couple parts as I'm thinking through your question, and the first part is in terms of kind of pressure. I don't feel pressure in the sense like, you know, if I don't change this, right, then it's all on me. I think departments are many institutions within a larger institution, and change across any of that is difficult, right? It takes more than one person. That being said, I think part of my hire, and part of a cluster hire of several urban planners that all engage justice in some way, or thinking about climate change and community engagement and development. And so one of the things that, you know, our chair would like us to kind of charter is building out the planning program under geography. And so that is exciting to think about what would I want a planning program to look like that is really trying to embody an ethic that is centering Blackness, right? It is centering decolonial indigenous practices, centering communities and community voices and sovereignty. I think there's a part of me that, whether it's my cynicism or just the reality, I also recognize that, similarly to, you know, DEI committees, and that there's often a lot of interest in conversations, or you know, we want your input or your advice. Often what's lacking is the actual power to change things, right? Or money to make things happen. And so I think while I have a lot of this excitement about thinking about where this program could go, right? Where myself and my colleagues could really form these various different aspects of our work and interests. I think there is a part of me that's like, well, we'll see how much power we're given, right, to actually influence structure, and what that support looks like, because I think that is oftentimes the challenge. And I do appreciate, I know there are a lot of people that have a lot of feelings about the restructuring of Arizona State University's department system, and I can never remember their names because they're just, you know, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. But I do think there is some value to having a kind of top-down approach to saying, no, we really do want to try and implement a school-wide interdisciplinary thought process, right? And do away with some of these more rigid department discipline fields. And I think that being said, right, within my own department, I'm building collaborations with researchers in anthropology and sociology, in engineering, right? I think through my own work, I'm trying to break those walls of communication down to really think about what can I add, what is similar to our work, that, because our approach is different, allows us to enrich the research even further. And so, I guess I don't necessarily feel pressure. I think I know what I'm doing is important, and I know that hopefully everyone else will follow along, or if not, they will be left behind. There was actually a panel yesterday with Cary Institute and Dr. Marcus Hendricks, who's at UMD College Park, said, you know, folks will either need to go big or stay home. And so I really like that, and I think that's the model I'm moving with my own work.
Yeah, I think for me, I'll try to keep my response here short. I think I feel very similarly to Fushcia in that, I don't feel any pressure. I think that the answer to that question also depends on the scale at which you imagine your impact to really matter. Like, there's no way that I could ever convince myself that like what I'm doing will change all of EEB department and whatever institution that I'm in. And so I think that my goals are far more practical for myself in thinking about what are the ways that I might impact my students, right? What are the ways that I might impact my lab culture? And those are the things that I think will shift how students experience higher education in ways that can be quite meaningful. So I sort of think of myself as a person and resource that will recognize the value of what students care about beyond just the science, and have that be the kind of space that they can enter, and then make connections between other known colleagues at the institution that have similar value systems, and sort of make those connections. Because I think one of the harmful things that is done in ecology is to really bring in students to improve diversity, but then they're just sort of left to figure out the hidden curriculum and the politics and the culture, and I think that that is a disservice. And so I feel that my role is to help support those students in particular make their way through systems, and I think that if you do that with enough students, you really start to shift the demographics of the field overall. And so I think that it also, I said I would be short, but now I'm just like, one more thing. It does depend on how much power you have, right? Like, I recognize that there will be some meaningfulness to the fact that I am the only Black faculty member in this department that I'm going to enter into. It's not something uncommon to me, but it does mean that there will be certain kinds of spoken or unspoken expectations of my role within that department. And I will choose to fill those roles as I see fit, right? I think that there is some value in recognizing that I have agency in what I decide to do. And if I enter into a space that does not feel like one that will accept the things that are valuable to me, I won't try to force it to. I will just leave for one that I think does, or build one that I think does. And so I think the notion of trying to change EEB would be, I would never sleep, I feel like, if that were really my goal. And so that's kind of the way that I think about it, which I think leads to my, or like explains my persistence in this field in the first place. So.
Yeah.
Do I talk in here?
Yeah. Just like that.
This is a question for Alec. You were speaking of the importance of getting permission from indigenous peoples and negotiating with them. Now, presumably you need to get permission from governmental agencies and government officials. And I know in terms of what happens in the United States and elsewhere, that the interests of indigenous peoples and the government are not always in tune with each other. I have some doubts or about whether interests of indigenous groups are actually prioritized in real life situations or not. I mean, they may be consulted, but like in, say, Australia and the United States, there have been, the government wishes to mine minerals, for instance, and uranium or whatever. Indigenous groups are often opposed to this, and also they need to use resources from areas that governments, for one reason or another, want to set apart for one reason or other. So, I mean, is this really something, have you had a problem with this? Have you had a problem with conflict of interest between governments? And how much weight do the wishes of indigenous peoples ever really carry?
Yeah, so that is a great question. I think that on the one hand, so thinking about asking for permission and recognizing that the goals and desires of like an agency or an institution or the government might be diametrically opposed to the goals and needs of indigenous communities, and sort of how do you deal with that? My policy, and this may not be true for everyone, if I get a yes from the government and a no from the community, I won't do the work. Like, that is just, and I recognize that that means that there are some kinds of questions and some kinds of ways ways that I might be able to engage that I can't. But I think that we do need to start accepting no as an answer from time to time. And there might be room for overlap where you can sort of find middle grounds across different entities. But I do feel quite strongly about respecting what the local communities and indigenous communities are saying and what their boundaries are. And so, so in that regard, that's how I deal with, that's how I dance that dance, in that I don't dance it at all. And so I don't do the work in that area unless there is a way in which I can shift my goals to meet the needs of the people in those places. And so that's kind of my practice and policy. I know that the government, as sort of this large amorphous entity that has power and resources, really tends to have the final say in certain things. But I think there's something to be said about, so if the goal, let's say, for example, the goal is money long-term, you can't have sustainable income if you use up a resource in its entirety. And so I think that we can convince governments to have practices that allow for sustainable long-term use of resources in ways that are equitable and include values of communities. And I think that one convincing argument for that is the dollar value, right? So recognizing how much you might get over time. And I know it means sort of feeling dirty and being capitalist in your mindset, but I also know that that is the language that many speak, and so it's important to be aware of that and have that discussion. So that's kind of how I negotiate those kinds of circumstances.
Hi, I'm involved in starting a project to co-produce knowledge for policymakers on rapid Arctic change. And the two main co-producers are Western scientists and indigenous knowledge holders. And we're starting off focusing on coastal communities. So these are people who know something about sea ice and about marine mammals. And what I'm a bit naive about is whether there are similar groups to these indigenous knowledge holders who are fairly well characterized in the Arctic in urban environments. If that makes sense.
Sure does. And it's sometimes hard to ferret out who to talk to because sometimes there are overlapping sort of constituencies and you have the complexity of city or county agencies that have some jurisdiction. You have sometimes religious communities that are invested in particular places. You sometimes have not-for-profits. So you get a really actually complex landscape that you have to understand and negotiate within. So yeah.
And maybe if I'm also understanding your question, you're asking if there's kind of an equivalent of the indigenous scientists that you're working with? Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, the activism side of environmental justice, right, and where it started in terms of organizing comes out of Black communities. And a lot of that has come from Black women in those communities seeing that there are health impacts that they are themselves experiencing, their children are experiencing, things about their environment that is changing that didn't exist, you know, when they were children. And so in terms of thinking about, you know, who knows the environment best, right? It's the people that are living there. And so a lot of organizations, whether, you know, you're thinking about like the Sunrise Movement, which is national but also has local chapters. Why am I blanking on her name? I can't remember. There was just an event commemorating what would have been her birthday, but a lot of the environmental justice work that came out of Chicago was because of a Black woman that was living on the South Side in one of the public housing communities, and the observations that she made, right? The Greenbelt movement, which is a global effort to lead reforestation efforts, started by a Kenyan woman, Wangari Maathai, because she noticed a declining in water quality and other types of species biodiversity in in Kenya as she was growing up, because of deforestation efforts and urbanization. And so I think, depending on where you are, looking to see who are the organizations that are active within environmental justice, or even a lot of social justice movements, because oftentimes there is still an overlap between the efforts that are being organized around and connections to your physical and environmental space. Mm-hmm.
I think we have time for one more question, unless is there anything on the chat, Crystal?
Hi. So for context, I did my bachelor's in like an environmental management school actually, and I remember we'd hear things like environmental managers try to do things like adaptive management, where they keep track of like the results of their like restoration techniques that they're using, and then there's also things like sorry, I'm trying to remember. I mean, like, I guess I'm curious, like, so there's, and I would also hear stories like, if you go to, like, the people in a community and sort of let them set, like, their own fishing thresholds, for example, it'll actually end up being oftentimes higher than, like, the thresholds that the managers were, like, planning on imposing. So I was curious for all of you, like, do you think that some of this work is happening, like, in parallel, sort of outside of academia? And if so, like, how hard is it to find out about what people are doing? Like, are there like white papers and stuff coming out, or yeah?
Yeah, I can give a quick answer. So on my side of things, so I am transitioning into mangrove stuff. So a lot of what I get into and read about and engage with is mangrove related. And some of the best examples that I have seen of community-led or community-informed mangrove restoration and conservation is coming out of Southeast Asia, and there's a ton of it. So like there's Thailand, Malaysia, and to some extent Singapore are like three great examples of places that are doing on-the-ground work that's being led by local communities and supported by academics. And so most of that is funded through either some, like various channels, right? So more traditional academic funding versus NGOs. The Global Mangrove Project, or Mangrove Action Project, Mangrove Words in the title of this organization, they do a ton of it. And so they, I think, are sort of the gold standard, at least for me, in terms of this kind of work being done. And there are papers, which I can dig up if you want some specifics and send your way, but there's certainly good examples out there, even today, of how to do this work in a collaborative and sort of equitably sustainable way.
Well, since Stewart won't chat, I will highlight him instead, because I do think that the urban LTRs are one space where that is happening, right? There's a lot of collaboration between the Cary Institute, for example, right, and the Baltimore LTR work that has been done for decades, and I don't remember if it's the U.S. Forest Service or where's more? Is that the U.S. Forest? The Morgan? Yeah, right. Government, local agencies or department, kind of state level departments, where yes, there is this interaction of research to inform policy or practice, and I think the reality also is that cities in particular, and all forms of managed space, right, move forward and continue to move forward over time, right? Climate change mitigation and adaptation is something that would likely be done whether research was there or not, and certainly research can help inform that. And so I think there's a lot of things that are happening at municipal levels where ideally there's a connection to a research institute or university, but there may not be, right? And especially with smaller towns or rural communities that don't have those resources, they are still trying to figure out what they can and cannot do with the budget that they have in order to manage the spaces that they've been charged with, right, and fall within those boundaries. And so I think, I'm also a very, very local person, like looking at where you're living and who and what the governance is in your state or town can be really helpful to figure out where are the decision makers and what are those decisions. And then, you know, that's then when the relationship building comes into play. Mm-hmm.
So unfortunately, we are out of time. But this has been a really great discussion, and I hope this inspires everyone here to continue having discussions like these on this topic, because this is the only way we are going to move forward for a future that I think we all collectively can agree we want. But please join me in thanking our speakers for joining us today. And they will be around a little bit, and we will be having a reception outside, a small reception, so feel free to join us and continue the conversation.
Yeah. And just as a reminder, the symposium will continue the next 3 Fridays online over Zoom, so keep an eye out for that and hope to see you there. Thank you.